The studio lights blazed like a courtroom spotlight, catching every flicker of rage on Kellyanne Conway's face. Her voice cut through the air, sharp, relentless, pitched high with fury. She wasn't debating. She was screaming. Words tumbled over each other in a flurry of accusations, her hands slicing through the space between her and her opponent, as if volume and aggression alone could win the night. The cameras drank it in. This was not reason, not persuasion, but raw spectacle. Across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, unflinching. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink in the face of the verbal storm tearing across the table. Her stillness became its own kind of defiance, a striking counterweight to Conway's chaos, where Kellyanne's face contorted. With every syllable, Jasmine's expression remained serene, a calm sea against a hurricane. The contrast was breathtaking. One woman unraveling in front of millions, the other radiating composure like armor. The moderator tried to interject, his voice cracking as he attempted to corral the fury, but Conway bulldozed right over him, her pitch climbing higher, her fingers stabbing the air like a weapon. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, pulled into the vortex of conflict, waiting to see if the storm would ever break. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs swallowed by Conway's relentless barrage, and, still, Jasmine remained motionless. The cameras lingered on her face, magnifying the silence, amplifying the restraint. In that silence lived an unspoken power, the kind that made you wonder, how long can she hold? What happens when she finally chooses to speak? The nation was watching two Americas embodied in two women, one frantic, desperate, clinging to volume, the other rooted, composed, exuding a dignity that needed no microphone to carry. The tension was unbearable, like a held breath stretched to its limit. Then the briefest flicker crossed Jasmine's face, not anger, not fear, but a glimmer of something sharper. Her lips parted slightly, her hand slid toward the microphone. For the first time that night, Conway hesitated, sensing the shift. The audience froze, the moderator froze, even the cameras seemed to lean forward, bracing for the release of what had been held back. But what Jasmine said next left the entire panel stunned. To understand why this moment hit like a lightning bolt across the country, you have to step back and see the stage that was already set. The nation was not just divided, it was bruised, raw, exhausted from years of political chaos. People weren't tuning into debates or panels for policy nuance anymore. They were tuning in to witness collisions, to see which voice could cut through the noise. And in that arena, Kellyanne Conway had long been a master of spectacle. She built her reputation on disruption, on never letting a question land without twisting it into a weapon. For years, her technique was the same: dominate the space, rattle the opponent, refuse to let silence or humility dictate the terms of engagement. Conway thrived in noise. She understood that outrage traveled farther, and she wielded it like a career-long strategy. Millions had watched her spar with journalists, dismiss experts, and bulldoze moderators into submission. By the time she walked into that studio, she carried the confidence of someone who had turned chaos into a brand. But this time, she wasn't facing a seasoned media figure or a worn-down anchor. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, a Congresswoman on the rise, carrying with her the energy of someone who hadn't yet been bent by Washington's cynicism. Crockett represented a different current in American politics, sharp, unbothered, and unapologetically rooted in identity and principle. Her supporters admired not just her policy positions but her presence, her refusal to shrink when confronted with arrogance. For many, she was the voice they'd been waiting to see on those stages, a living rejection of the old playbook. And so, when Conway's voice erupted, when her usual strategy of overwhelming an opponent with sheer force came roaring, out the country expected another familiar scene. A clash where the loudest voice won, where intimidation drowned out reason. But Crockett wasn't playing by those rules. Her silence, her poise, her refusal to be baited, turned the formula upside down. Suddenly the old tricks didn't land. Suddenly, The audience wasn't leaning into Conway's noise. They were leaning into Jasmine's quiet strength. This was not just two women clashing in a studio. This was a collision of archetypes, two visions of America colliding under the hot studio lights. On one side, the loud, unapologetic, relentless spin that had defined a political era many were desperate to leave behind. On the other, a new voice rising, calm but cutting, drawing strength from authenticity rather than volume. It wasn't just a debate, it was a cultural referendum. And that's why the room felt different. That's why viewers at home weren't just entertained, they were transfixed. They could sense it. This wasn't just another shouting match. It was something bigger, something that spoke to where the country had been and where it was going. Kellyanne's screams weren't just directed at Jasmine. They echoed the desperation of a political brand losing its grip. Jasmine's silence wasn't just composure. It was resistance, a refusal to play the part written for her. In that studio, the symbolic weight was undeniable. The air grew heavier, the tension more charged, as if everyone watching, inside the studio and across living rooms nationwide, could feel history sharpening its pen. Conway thought she was in control of the scene, but the real power was shifting, invisibly, steadily, into Crockett's hands. And if you thought this was just another shouting match, you're dead wrong. For years, Kellyanne Conway thrived in the glare of the spotlight, a political strategist who transformed into a household name not by reasoned persuasion, but by sheer audacity. To her admirers, she was sharp, quick-witted, impossible to pin down. To her critics, she was the embodiment of spin, a living avatar of the post-truth era. Her greatest weapon was not facts, but the ability to bend them, reframe them, or bury them beneath a relentless avalanche of words. She rose to national fame as a fierce defender of the Trump administration, mastering the art of dodging questions with acrobatic precision. When pressed on uncomfortable truths, she reached for euphemisms that would become infamous, alternative facts being the most enduring. That phrase alone crystallized her reputation, a woman willing to stretch reality until it snapped, then smile as though nothing had broken. Television studios were her natural habitat. She knew the rhythms of live interviews, knew how to overwhelm hosts by refusing to pause, how to seize control of a segment simply by refusing to yield the floor. For her, debates weren't about clarity, they were about dominance. And time after time, she succeeded, leaving interviewers visibly rattled and opponents visibly frustrated. But beneath the veneer of confidence was something more telling, an arrogance so entrenched it became a liability. Conway carried herself with the unshakable certainty that she could not be beaten on her own stage. She had stared down seasoned journalists, career politicians, and critics armed with reams of evidence. Yet through it all, she doubled down, never conceding, never softening, never allowing even the smallest crack in her armor. That refusal to bend became her brand. And for a long time, the strategy worked. She became a lightning rod of attention, a fixture on late-night monologues, a name that sparked strong emotions wherever it was spoken. Outrage only amplified her platform, and ridicule only seemed to fuel her resolve. In the ecosystem of political theater, Kellyanne Conway understood the currency of controversy, and she spent it lavishly. But there was a cost. The more she leaned into confrontation, the more she became a caricature in the eyes of many Americans. Her every appearance was expected to be combative, her every sentence anticipated as a dodge or deflection. She was no longer a strategist behind the curtain, she was the performance itself. And in the performance, arrogance often overwhelmed substance. By the time she sat across from Jasmine Crockett in that studio, Kellyanne was carrying years of accumulated contradictions. She had claimed dignity while belittling others, insisted on truth while peddling spin, demanded respect while offering none in return. Her strategy was to shout past the contradictions, to bulldoze through them before anyone could point too long or too hard. But there's a problem with relying on noise. It only works when the opponent accepts the noise as the rules of engagement. Conway had spent her career facing people who fought fire with fire, who matched her speed and aggression with their own. That was a battlefield she understood and often won. But on this night, she would not find herself in familiar territory. Because arrogance has one fatal flaw. It assumes the old playbook always works. It presumes the future will always mirror the past. And as Conway launched into her now familiar barrage, cutting off, speaking over, stretching the truth until it threatened to snap, she believed, as always, that sheer volume would tilt the scales. The irony was as cinematic as it was inevitable. The louder she grew, the more power she lost. Her legacy of spin and showmanship had prepared her for a clash of noise, but it had not prepared her for silence. It had not prepared her for the possibility that the person sitting across from her would refuse to play the game she'd perfected. Kellyanne Conway thought she was walking into yet another skirmish she could control, another opponent she could bulldoze, another performance where she dictated the tempo. But Conway had no idea she was about to face a very different kind of opponent. Long before her name was trending across social media, long before the cameras lingered on her steady face in that tense studio, Jasmine Crockett had lived a story that prepared her for moments exactly like this one. Hers was not the path of privilege or easy access to power. It was the story of a woman who carved her way into the public eye through struggle, service, and a relentless refusal to be silenced. Born and raised in St. Louis, Crockett grew up in a community that knew hardship well. She witnessed injustice not as an abstract political talking point, but as the lived reality of her neighbors and friends. Violence, poverty, and discrimination weren't statistics. They were stories she carried with her. From a young age, she felt the weight of knowing how easily voices could be drowned out, how quickly dignity could be dismissed. Those lessons didn't harden her. They sharpened her resolve. When she chose law as her path, it wasn't out of ambition alone. It was because she saw in the law a tool, an imperfect one, but a tool nonetheless, for defending those most easily cast aside. She became a public defender, standing between the machinery of the state and those with no one else to fight for, them. In crowded courtrooms, she learned what composure meant. She learned that sometimes the most powerful presence was not the one shouting the loudest, but the one who refused to yield to intimidation. Day after day, she represented clients who had little more than hope to bring into the courtroom. In those rooms, where stakes were measured in years of freedom lost or preserved, Jasmine learned how to keep her voice steady, even when the odds towered against her. She understood the importance of calm, of clarity, of refusing to let arrogance dictate the terms of battle. It was here, far from TV cameras, that her armor was forged. Her transition into politics came naturally. Serving in the Texas House of Representatives and later in Congress, Crockett carried with her the same values that defined her legal work: service before spotlight, substance over spectacle. She built a reputation not on theatrics, but on authenticity. She did not pretend to be perfect, nor did she seek to be all things to all people. Instead, she was unapologetically herself, a black woman in spaces where voices like hers were too often marginalized or ignored. And that unapologetic authenticity became her quiet superpower. Where others postured, she spoke plainly. Where others grew flustered, she held firm. Her colleagues and constituents alike described her as a fighter, but not the kind who needed to pound a table to prove it. Her strength came from the fact that she had already faced the storms of dismissal, prejudice, and doubt, and she had not been moved. What set her apart, and what would soon make her viral, was the way she embodied dignity under pressure. Dignity was not a slogan for her. It was the very essence of how she moved through the world. It was in the way she listened before speaking, the way she absorbed attacks without losing her balance, the way she refused to allow arrogance to dictate the tempo of her response. In a political landscape addicted to outrage, Jasmine Crockett carried the rare gift of composure. This composure was not passive. It was active, deliberate, honed. To remain calm in the face of aggression is not weakness, it is control. And Jasmine had mastered it. She had mastered it in courtrooms filled with skeptics, in legislative chambers filled with power brokers, and in communities filled with those who depended on her to speak when their voices were silenced. Her rise was not just a personal triumph, it was symbolic. For many Americans, particularly women of color, watching Jasmine ascend to the national stage was a validation of their own struggles, their own dignity, their own right to be seen and heard. She carried them with her in every moment, a living rebuke to the notion that arrogance could define the narrative forever. And so, when the lights of that studio bore down on her, when Kellyanne Conway unleashed her familiar storm of noise, Jasmine Crockett was not shaken. She had walked into storms before, real ones, life-changing ones, and she had survived. The cameras might have caught her stillness, her silence, but behind that composure was a lifetime of preparation, a foundation so steady it could not be moved by shouting. That night, viewers across the country would see two women share a stage, but those who knew Jasmine's story understood the deeper truth. She was not just sitting in a chair, waiting to respond. She was standing on the shoulders of every trial, every dismissal, every moment she had faced down injustice with nothing but her calm and her courage. And it was this very journey that prepared her for the moment the cameras would roll. Temperature in the studio rose with every passing second. Kellyanne Conway leaned forward in her chair, her voice ricocheting off the walls, cutting across the moderator and steamrolling any attempt at order. She jabbed the air with her finger, her sentences a barrage of interruptions. Every time Jasmine's name crossed her lips, it was sharpened like a blade. "You don't know what you're talking about," she spat, shaking her head with exaggerated disbelief. "This is exactly why people don't take your side seriously." The moderator raised his hand, his voice strained with the effort of control. "Let's give Congresswoman Crockett a chance." But Conway shot back instantly, talking over him, raising her pitch, almost daring anyone to stop her. The performance wasn't about dialogue anymore. It was about dominance. Yet across the table, Jasmine sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed, her posture unbroken, while Conway's every gesture screamed desperation, her hands slicing the air, her words tumbling too quickly, her breath shallow. Jasmine's very stillness became louder than the shouting. It was the difference between chaos and control, the villain unraveling and the hero steadying the room without saying a word. The audience could feel the imbalance. Murmurs rippled through the studio. Some leaned back uncomfortably. Some leaned forward, waiting to see if Jasmine would break, but she didn't. She waited. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was patience, almost surgical in its timing. Every insult Conway hurled only made the tension tighter, like a spring winding itself to the breaking point. Conway noticed it too. For all her experience in commanding attention, there was something unnerving about an opponent who didn't bite, didn't interrupt, didn't even flinch. The louder she grew, the more glaring the contrast became. She called Jasmine uninformed, accused her of grandstanding, even ridiculed her experience. But with each jab, Jasmine's calm only sharpened the edges of Conway's frenzy. The cameras picked up every detail, the way Conway's hair shook as she gestured wildly, the way sweat began to glisten under the hot lights, the way her voice cracked ever so slightly as she overextended. By comparison, Jasmine looked almost regal, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her breathing steady, her eyes unblinking. And then it happened, the moment that electrified the tension. Conway leaned so far across the table it seemed she might spring from her chair. She shouted over the moderator's attempt at a question, her words tumbling in a final crescendo. "Say something. Defend yourself. Go ahead." Her demand rang. Less a question than a challenge, her voice quivering with a desperation she couldn't disguise. The room fell into a suspended silence. Even Conway, still panting, seemed to realize she had pushed the moment to its peak. All eyes turned to Jasmine. Viewers across the country held their breath. This was the breaking point. And then Jasmine finally leaned into her mic. Jasmine. Crockett leaned forward at last, her hand resting gently against the microphone as though she were steadying the very air around her. The contrast was immediate. After minutes of Kellyanne Conway's relentless shouting, the sound of silence had become deafening. The audience froze, the cameras zoomed in, and Conway herself, mid-breath, mid-gesture, hesitated. It was as if time itself had been waiting for Jasmine to move. She didn't rush. She didn't match volume with volume. She simply drew a breath, her voice emerging low, measured, and sharp enough to slice through the noise that had dominated the night. "Are you finished?" she asked quietly, almost tenderly, like a teacher addressing a child caught misbehaving. The words landed with surgical precision. Gasps fluttered through the audience, and even the moderator's eyes widened. Conway blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the calmness, the restraint, the refusal to be baited into the chaos. For a split second, the studio shifted. The energy Conway had spent so long building suddenly evaporated, like a balloon, pricked by a pin. Jasmine's calmness was not passive, it was commanding. It told everyone watching that dignity had not only survived the storm, it had risen above it. She continued, her tone unwavering. "You've spoken over me, over the moderator, over the audience. But volume doesn't equal truth. Shouting doesn't make your point stronger. It just makes it harder for people to take you seriously." Her words fell slowly, deliberately, each sentence like a steady drumbeat. The audience murmured in agreement, the ripple of validation spreading visibly across the room. Conway shifted uncomfortably in her chair, attempting to laugh, but the sound came out brittle. She interjected, "That's not..." only for Jasmine to lift a single hand, palm open, not in anger but in authority. "I let you speak," she said firmly, "and now it's my turn." The effect was electric. Conway, so used to controlling the tempo, suddenly sat back, visibly rattled. Jasmine pressed on, her words calm but cutting. "When you call me uninformed, what you're really saying is that you don't respect my experience. But I didn't grow up with the luxury of dismissing other people's struggles. I've lived them. I've defended people in court who didn't have anyone else. I've sat with families who were told the system wasn't for them. And I've walked into these halls of power not to shout people down, but to stand for those who've been ignored." Every sentence was a revelation, unfolding with the deliberate pacing of someone who knew she had the room in her hand. The audience leaned forward, nodding, clapping softly until the clapping turned into applause. The moderator, caught between professionalism and awe, let it happen. For once, he didn't dare interrupt. Conway tried again to interject, her voice sharp and defensive. "This isn't about your story, Congresswoman." But her words crumbled beneath Jasmine's reply. "Everything is about our stories," Jasmine said, her voice rising just enough to carry. "That's what America is. Millions of stories, all deserving of respect. You don't get to scream over mine just because you're afraid it doesn't." "Match yours." The applause swelled louder now, spontaneous and uncontrollable. Conway looked around, visibly rattled, her practiced confidence cracking under the weight of the moment. For the first time she appeared small, her earlier bravado collapsing in the face of dignity too steady to be shaken. And Jasmine wasn't done. She leaned even closer, her eyes locked on Conway's. "I don't need to raise my voice to prove I'm right. I don't need to insult you to make a point, because truth speaks for itself. And if you can't hear it over your own shouting, that's not my weakness, it's yours." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The studio erupted, applause thundered, gasps and cheers collided. The cameras panned across the faces of the audience, capturing shock, awe, admiration. On social media, where the live feed was already being clipped and shared, hashtags began forming in real time. Calm over chaos. Dignity wins. Conway tried to recover, fumbling for her notes, her smile strained and forced. She attempted another jab, but the power had already shifted irreversibly. No matter what she said now, it would be remembered. Not as dominance, but as desperation. The moderator turned to Jasmine, inviting her to continue. His tone softened, deferential even. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply straightened her posture, her face calm, her voice even. "At the end of the day," she said, "our country doesn't need louder voices. It needs steadier ones. It needs leaders who can withstand the storm without becoming part of it." The applause that followed was unlike anything the show had seen. It wasn't just polite acknowledgement. It was visceral, emotional, charged with the sense that something historic had just happened. Conway sat back in her chair, her eyes darting nervously, her hands tightening around her notes. She had been beaten not by volume, not by aggression, but by a presence that made her own theatrics look hollow. The silence Jasmine wielded was more devastating than any insult Conway could conjure. The cameras captured every second, the fall of arrogance, the rise of dignity, the transformation of a panel debate into a cultural moment. Viewers at home would replay it again and again, the clip spreading like wildfire within hours. In living rooms across the country, people whispered to themselves what the studio already knew. Something had shifted. The storm was over. Jasmine Crockett had spoken, and the room, the nation, was listening. But the shockwaves didn't stop in that studio. The moment Jasmine Crockett leaned into her mic and delivered her calm, devastating response, the studio may as well have turned into ground zero for a cultural earthquake. The applause hadn't even died down before clips were being sliced, uploaded, and launched into the bloodstream of the internet. By the time the program cut to commercial, Twitter was already alive with hashtags blazing across timelines. "DR's calm over chaos," "Your dignity wins," and even a more playful Jasmine mic drop. The first wave came from ordinary viewers. Tweets poured in with captions like, "This is how you handle a bully," and "No amount of shouting can match this level of composure." GIFs appeared within minutes. Conway frozen mid-shout beside Jasmine's serene face, overlaid with captions like, "When you bring chaos, but she brings the calm." TikTok creators jumped in, remixing Jasmine's words into soundtracks, setting her mic drop line against dramatic beats. The moment wasn't just viral, it was cultural currency. Then came the commentators. Progressive voices on cable. News replayed the clip with an almost reverent tone. "This wasn't just a debate takedown," one anchor declared. "It was a masterclass in dignity." Even outlets that typically dismissed Crockett couldn't ignore the story, framing it as the moment that stopped Kellyanne Conway in her tracks. Headlines blared across homepages. Conway shouted, Crockett stood tall. Mic drop heard around the country. Within hours, celebrities joined the chorus. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "This is how queens move. No noise, just power." John Legend reposted the clip with a simple caption, "Poise, panic." Activists shared it as a teaching moment, tagging it with words like leadership and representation. Even some unexpected voices chimed in. Seasoned journalists who had endured Conway's tactics in the past admitted, almost gleefully, that watching Jasmine turn the script upside down felt like vindication. But perhaps the most powerful validation came not from celebrities or pundits, but from everyday people whose identities resonated with Jasmine's composure. Black women across social media wrote about what it meant to see someone who looked like them hold her ground without raising her voice. Immigrants wrote about how her calm dignity reflected the quiet battles they fought every day against dismissal and disrespect. Parents posted clips with captions like, "This is what I'm showing my daughter tonight." The ripple effect didn't stop at admiration. It sparked conversations. Articles dissected the psychology of composure under pressure, contrasting it with the futility of arrogance and noise. Editorials highlighted Jasmine as emblematic of a new kind of leadership, one rooted not in theatrics, but in resilience. College classrooms and church sermons began referencing the moment, replaying the clip as evidence of how dignity triumphs when arrogance overreaches. Meanwhile, Conway's reaction, or lack thereof, became its own meme. Screenshots of her blinking in stunned silence spread quickly with captions like, "When your whole playbook stops working, and louder isn't stronger." For someone who had built her career on controlling narratives, Conway now found herself trapped in one she couldn't escape. The clip traveled faster than even Jasmine's supporters anticipated. By the following morning, it had been viewed tens of millions of times across platforms. News outlets abroad picked it up, framing it as yet another example of America's culture wars playing out in real time. Commentators in Europe, Asia, and Africa noted how the exchange mirrored global struggles between arrogance and dignity, noise and substance. And then came the real test. Would the moment fade as just another viral skirmish? Or would it live on as something larger? The answer revealed itself almost immediately. Organizers of grassroots campaigns began incorporating Jasmine's words into their rallies. Protest signs appeared with phrases like, "Volume truth." Advocacy groups created graphics quoting her mic drop line, encouraging people to register to vote, to stay engaged, to believe in the power of calm resistance. What had started as one clash in one studio was now spiraling outward into a symbol. People weren't just sharing the video for entertainment. They were sharing it as validation, as inspiration, as proof that arrogance could be defeated not by matching chaos, but by rising above it. In living rooms, workplaces, and classrooms, the conversation shifted. It wasn't just, "Did you see Jasmine take down Conway?" It was, "That's how I want to handle myself the next time someone tries to shout me down." The moment had crossed from spectacle into parable. And yet the true meaning of Jasmine's words would echo even louder. In the days after the confrontation, the clip continued to spread. But what gave it staying power wasn't just the entertainment value. It was what the moment represented. People weren't only laughing at Kellyanne Conway's unraveling. They were reflecting on what Jasmine Crockett had revealed, that in a world addicted to noise, calm truth still cuts the deepest. Because at its core, this wasn't simply about one woman out-debating another on television. It was about a collision of values. On one side, arrogance, bluster, and a reliance on shouting down opposition. On the other, dignity, restraint, and the conviction that truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. The exchange became a mirror held up to America, forcing the country to ask, which voice are we going to follow? The one that drowns out others, or the one that stands unshaken even under fire? Jasmine's composure spoke to something timeless. History has always remembered the voices of dignity more than the voices of arrogance. Leaders who stood tall in the face of insult, communities who endured injustice with quiet strength, movements that gained their power not from volume, but from perseverance. These are the stories that last. And in her refusal to bend, Jasmine reminded viewers that dignity isn't passive. It is an act of courage. For many, the viral moment became a personal lesson. Teachers shared it with their students, not as politics, but as character, education. Activists replayed it at meetings to remind themselves that real strength doesn't always look like shouting. Families gathered around their TVs and phones, pointing out to their children, "See that? That's what leadership looks like." It wasn't about political affiliation. It was about a universal human truth. Calm will always outlast chaos. And that lesson came at a time America needed it most. With divisions deepening, with so many feeling silenced or shouted over, Jasmine's response was more than a mic drop. It was an invitation. It said, "You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to abandon dignity to defend yourself. You don't have to become part of the storm. You can be the calm that breaks it." Even those who disagreed with Jasmine politically found themselves acknowledging the power of her presence. Because the truth is undeniable. Arrogance exhausts itself. It burns out, it falters, it collapses under its own weight. But dignity endures. In that studio, Kellyanne Conway represented a strategy America had seen for too long: overwhelm, distort, deny. Jasmine Crockett represented something else entirely: the unshakable belief that justice doesn't need to shout, it only needs to stand. That contrast became the moral heartbeat of the viral moment, and the reason it mattered far beyond the night it aired. As the applause faded, as the hashtags cooled, the lesson remained. Viewers carried it into their own lives, into workplaces, classrooms, dinner tables. The clip was replayed not only for entertainment, but as motivation. A reminder that the real victory doesn't come from matching your opponent's chaos. It comes from refusing to surrender your dignity. And that's why this viral moment wasn't just entertainment. It was a lesson for all of us. So, when we look back at that night, Kellyanne Conway screaming, trying to dominate, through volume, and Jasmine Crockett sitting steady, waiting for her moment, we realize why the world couldn't stop watching. This wasn't just about two women on a stage. It was about what happens when arrogance finally meets its match in dignity. It was about truth, spoken softly but landing louder than any scream ever could. And here's the real takeaway. Moments like this don't just go viral by accident. They go viral because people like you share them, talk about them, and pass them on as proof that calm, justice, and dignity can still triumph in a culture that often rewards noise. Every repost, every comment, every conversation keeps the story alive and makes sure the values it represents reach more people. So if this moment inspired you, don't let it end here. Share this video with your friends, your family, your community. Subscribe to this channel so you're part of a space where dignity is always louder than hate, where truth always cuts through the noise, because we're not just here to watch these moments, we're here to amplify them, to turn them into movements. The clash between Conway and Crockett may have been one debate, one viral clip. But the lesson, dignity outlasts arrogance, is timeless. It belongs to all of us. And as long as we carry it forward in our conversations, in our politics, in our daily lives, then every time someone tries to shout us down, we'll remember, calm is not weakness. Dignity is not silence. It is strength. And together we can make sure that strength is heard.